Give him back. Tu Tian's voice cut through the quiet afternoon like a blade the moment she saw it. The one thing no mother is ever prepared for. Her son, in someone else's arms. The school gate buzzed with the usual noise, children laughing, parents calling names, teachers guiding the last few students out. But for Tu Tian, all of it faded into nothing the second her eyes locked onto the scene in front of her. A man, tall, familiar, holding her child. Her heart stopped. James? The name escaped her lips before she could stop it, and just like that, the past came rushing back. James turned slowly, as if he had been expecting this moment, his arms still wrapped securely around the small boy who looked confused but calm, unaware of the storm that had just begun. Tu Tian, he said, his voice low, steady, almost too calm, but she didn't respond, because she was already moving. Give me my son! She rushed forward, her hands shaking as she pulled the child into her arms, holding him tightly against her chest, like she was afraid he would disappear if she loosened her grip even for a second. Mama? The boy whispered, confused. I'm here, she murmured, pressing her face into his hair, her breath uneven, her heart pounding violently. Then, she looked up, straight at James, and everything changed. What are you doing here? She demanded, her voice sharp, protective, her body instinctively placing itself between him and her child. James didn't move, didn't react. He just looked at her, then at the boy, and something in his expression tightened. That's my son. The words landed like thunder. Tu Tian froze, for a split second. Then, what? Her voice rose instantly, disbelief flooding her eyes. Are you crazy? But James didn't back down, not even slightly. I've been looking for him, he said. For both of you. Her grip on the child tightened. That has nothing to do with you anymore, she snapped. You lost that right a long time ago. James took a step closer, and that was enough to make her step back. Let me see him, he said. No. The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without doubt. The air between them turned cold, tense, dangerous. I deserve to know the truth, James continued, his voice lower now, more intense. You disappeared. You never told me anything. I don't owe you anything, she shot back. You owe me this, he said, pointing at the child. That was the wrong move. Tu Tian's eyes darkened immediately. Don't you dare, she warned. And then, a voice behind her. Tian? Jack. She turned instantly. Relief, fear, everything at once. Jack! Jack walked toward them, his expression calm but alert, his eyes quickly scanning the situation. The tension, the man standing too close, the way Tu Tian was holding their son like she was protecting him from something, from someone. Is everything okay? Jack asked, but his eyes were already on James. James looked at him, then back at Tu Tian. Who is this? He asked. The question was simple, but loaded. Tu Tian didn't hesitate. My husband. The word hit, hard. Jack stepped forward, now standing beside her, not in front, not behind, beside. And this is my son, Jack added, his voice calm but firm, his hand gently resting on the boy's back. The statement was clear, direct, final. James let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Your son? He repeated, then looked back at Tu Tian. You really didn't tell him? Tu Tian's body stiffened instantly. Stop it. But James continued. You left without a word, he said, his eyes locked on hers. And now suddenly, you have a husband and a child that looks exactly the age he should be. The implication hung in the air, heavy, sharp, unavoidable. Jack's hand tightened slightly, just slightly, but enough. What is he talking about? Jack asked quietly. Tu Tian turned to him immediately. Jack, don't listen to him. I'm asking you, Jack said, still calm, but now focused. Her heart dropped, because she knew this moment mattered. "He's lying," she said quickly. "He's just trying to—" "I'm not lying," James cut in. "I just want the truth." Then, he looked at Jack, directly. "If you're so sure, then let's prove it." Silence. "DNA test," James said. The words echoed, like a challenge, like a threat, like something that could destroy everything. Tu Tian shook her head immediately. "No, we're not doing that." But Jack didn't respond. His eyes moved slowly from James to the child, then to her. And for the first time, there was doubt. "Jack," her voice broke slightly. "I just want to be sure," he said. The words were soft, but they hurt more than anything. Because this time, it wasn't a stranger accusing her. It was him. The man she trusted the most. And in that moment, something inside her cracked. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Tu Tian had ever experienced, because this time it wasn't just fear pressing against her chest, it was something far more painful. The moment when the man she loved chose uncertainty over trust, even if only for a second, and that second was enough to make her hands tremble as she held her son tighter, as if she could protect him from something she didn't even know how to fight. "You don't believe me?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but it carried everything: hurt, disbelief, and something fragile breaking quietly inside. Jack didn't answer immediately, because he couldn't, because the question wasn't simple, and the moment wasn't light. His eyes stayed on her, searching, conflicted, torn between what he felt and what he was hearing, because the child in her arms, his child, was everything to him. But the words James had thrown into the air refused to disappear, clinging like shadows that wouldn't let go. "It's not about believing or not," he said finally, his voice lower now. "It's about ending this completely." That answer was careful, but it still hurt. Tu Tian closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again, and this time, she didn't argue. "Fine," she said quietly. Both men looked at her. "We'll do it," she continued, her voice steadier now, even though her hands were still shaking. "Not because I doubt, but because I don't want this to follow us anymore." Her gaze moved from Jack to James, cold, clear. "This ends today." James nodded slightly, as if he had expected nothing less. The next few days passed in a blur, cold, tense, uncertain. The hospital, white walls, sterile air, the sound of footsteps echoing down long corridors. Everything felt distant, muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Tu Tian sat on one side of the room, her son resting quietly beside her, unaware of the weight of the situation, playing with a small toy in his hands, occasionally looking up at her with innocent eyes that didn't understand why his mother wasn't smiling. Jack stood by the window, silent, still, watching nothing, thinking everything. James stood across from them, arms crossed, eyes fixed, waiting. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Until the door opened. The doctor stepped in, holding the results, and suddenly, everything became real. "Mr. Jack?" the doctor asked. Jack turned. His steps were slow, heavy, as if each one carried the weight of every doubt he had allowed to exist. "This is the result," the doctor said, handing over the file. Silence. Jack looked down, at the paper, at the words, at the truth. And in that moment, everything stopped. Then, he exhaled, a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "He's my son." The words were quiet, but they filled the entire room. Tu Tian closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not loud, not dramatic, just relief. James didn't move, didn't speak, but something in his expression changed. The certainty, Gone. I see, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, no longer sharp, no longer demanding. He looked at Tu Tian, then at the child, then finally, at Jack. I was wrong. The admission was simple, but it mattered. Jack didn't respond, because his attention was no longer on him. It was on her. He turned, slowly, and looked at Tu Tian. Really looked. At her eyes. At the tears she hadn't tried to hide. At the pain he had caused, not just today, but in that moment when he hesitated, when he allowed doubt to exist between them. I'm sorry, he said. No explanation, no defense, just those 2 words. And this time, they were enough to break the last piece of silence. Tu Tian didn't answer immediately. She stood up slowly, holding their son's hand, walked toward him, each step steady, not rushed, not hesitant. When she reached him, she stopped, looked up at him, and asked softly, "Next time, will you still choose doubt first?" The question wasn't angry. It was honest. Jack shook his head immediately. No. His answer came without hesitation this time, without fear, without confusion. I choose you, he said. I should have from the beginning. The words settled, real, firm. Tu Tian's grip on her son loosened slightly, not letting go, but no longer holding on out of fear. Don't let it happen again, she said. Not forgiveness, not fully, but a chance. Jack nodded. I won't. Behind them, James watched quietly, then turned and walked away. No more words, no more questions, because some things didn't belong to him anymore. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer, softer, like something had lifted. Jack bent down, picking up his son, holding him close, pressing his forehead gently against the boy's. My son, he whispered. The boy laughed, not understanding, but feeling safe. Tu Tian stood beside them, watching, breathing, letting everything settle. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, and this time, she didn't stop. Jack's arm moved naturally around her, not forced, not uncertain. Just right. They walked out together, not perfect, not untouched, but still together. Because sometimes, love isn't about never doubting. It's about